After the dense and reflective central canti of the Purgatorio, 15, 16, and 17, Dante picks up his narrative pace a bit. And from Canto 18 to Canto 24, the pilgrim and Virgil climb up 3 terraces. And indeed, the climbing seems to come faster and faster as they head up the mountain. After seeing the slothful, Dante seems particularly inspired to add zeal into his climbing. In Canto 19, at verse 64, Virgil tells the pilgrim, "Press your heels into the ground, raise your eyes to the lure. The eternal king whirls with his majestic sphere. Like the falcon, such I became, and so impelled I went, as far as the cleft rock allowed for the ascent, to where the circling starts again." And so in these fast-paced canti, the pilgrim and his guide move through the terrace of the slothful, that of the avaricious, and that of the gluttonous. In this lecture, I'll talk first about the memorable drama enacted on each of these 3 terraces, and then I'll return to talk about an important theme which ties together all these canti, the theme of the prayer of the heart, which is related to the medieval practice of Lectio Divina. After leaving the wrathful behind, Dante and Virgil climb up onto the 4th terrace, where they encounter the slothful. And it's telling that the one spokesman for the terrace of the slothful was a monk. "I was abbot of San Zeno at Verona," he tells the pilgrim at verse 118. And as is clear from this canto, acedia, or sloth, is more than just laziness, although that is a part of it. It's a deeper and more dangerous spiritual condition than that. In fact, in the Christian tradition, acedia, what we now call sloth, was a vice particularly feared by monks. But I think it's appropriate to take Dante's invitation to think about this spiritual condition, acedia, once again, because it's closely allied to what we might now call depression. At its root, acedia is a deep spiritual sorrow which paralyzes the will, makes you dull to doing good, and makes you incapable of enjoying the good things of life even when you're surrounded by them. Acedia leads you to assume that everyone around you is better off than you are, and that no one around you actually cares if you are well. Listen to this summary of the monastic warning against the dangers of acedia, a summary I take from a remarkable recent book by Mary Carruthers called The Experience of Beauty in the Middle Ages. Quote, "The desert monks introduced the Greek term acedia, defined in Latin as tedium. As acedia, tedium brings spiritual dryness, numbness of heart and of intellect. It is the noonday devil of the desert contemplatives, an ever-present temptation for those whose task it was to pray continuously." Carruthers goes on to quote from John Cassian's Institutes, quote, "When depression attacks the wretched monk, it engenders a loathing for his situation, dislike of his cell, and contemptuous disparagement of his brethren. It makes him desultory at any task to be done within the walls of his cell. He makes much of monasteries that are situated afar off and talks about their advantageous positions and healthier sites. He describes the community of brothers there, how friendly and how deeply spiritual they are, while in contrast, everything to hand is disagreeable. He looks anxiously this way and that, unhappy because no brother is coming to see him. He goes in and out of his cell and continuously looks at the sun as if it were slow in setting." Clearly, the old monks knew something about psychology. Their description of the difficulty of working within the cell could as well apply to the dorm room or the office. Several centuries later, though, Aquinas, drawing on this ancient tradition summarized above by Carruthers, provides us with this precise description of the cancerous spiritual state of acedia. It is an oppressive sorrow, which so weighs upon a man's mind that he wants to do nothing. Sloth implies a certain weariness of work, and it is a sluggishness of the mind which neglects to begin good. Aquinas goes on to say that acedia is a cancerous spiritual disease, which has a twofold evil inherent to it. It distorts your perspective of the world, and it makes you feel too tired to do the good to change it. With this background in mind, it's delightful to see how Dante constructs his terrace of the slothful. In contrast to the souls you'll remember in Inferno 6, who seem to be too spiritually sleepy to do anything but gurgle out their hymn, Dante's Acidiosi in Canto 18 of Purgatorio are alive with an energy greater than that displayed in any other canto. In fact, the pilgrim is only able to catch part of what the abbot of San Zeno says to him, because the penitent soul is shouting out his story over his shoulder, as it were, as he races past. "I know not," says the poet. If he said more, or was still, he'd already raced so far beyond us. But this I heard and chose to keep in mind. Although Canto 18 begins reflectively and slowly, with more meditation on love and freedom, it literally ends in a race. In the midst of their abstract conversation, the two travelers are caught up in a gigantic mass of runners, like those at a big city marathon. Only these runners are all sprinting. Suddenly, this drowsiness was snatched away by a crowd who were approaching, having already rounded the terrace from behind us. As once the rivers Ismenus and Aesopus saw a furious throng of revelers crowd their banks, on any night the Thebans felt the need for Bacchus, such a throng cut their way as does a sickle around that circle, and I could tell that virtuous will and just love drove them on. Soon they were upon us, for the whole frenzied mob was running, while two in front weeping cried out, "Quickly, quickly, lest time be lost for lack of zeal." The others cried out behind them, "Let our zeal for doing good make grace grow green again." This is a great depiction of a group of souls running as a frenzied mob. In fact, they're compared to the Bacchic revelers of ancient Thebes, who employed wine, wild music, and crazy dancing in their religious ritual. In opposition to the indifferent, who are stung by wasps to keep them moving after a meaningless banner, this is a crazy mass of runners, each of whom is madly running at top speed. And toward what? There's no particular goal to shoot for. Rather, they're running around and around the terrace, knowing that by doing so, they're slowly reforming their character. This then is Dante's contrapasso for those who here reform the sin of slack love. In the next terrace, we find an equally dramatic scene. The penitents on the fourth terrace of Mount Purgatory are bolted, as it were, face down onto the ground. With arms and legs stretched out, with noses squashed and foreheads flattened, they're forced to stare directly at the floor of the terrace. Dante has the spokesman of Canto 19, the Pope Adrian V, explain the fitting nature of this contrapasso for those who spent too much time fixated on earthly wealth in their life. He says, "The work of avarice is here proclaimed in the purging of the downturned souls, and the mountain gives no punishment more bitter. Just as we failed to lift our eyes on high because they were fixed on earthly things, so justice here has turned them to the earth. As avarice quenched our love of worthy things, wasting our chance to do good works, so justice here has bound us fast. Securely bound are our hands and feet. As long as it shall please the righteous Lord, so long shall we unmoving lie here prone." Dante senses how psychologically powerful this form of suffering is. Imagine having your head held in place for some time. You might submit to it at first, but soon you would begin pushing and moving and trying to escape. But then imagine that by some magical power, your head couldn't move a millimeter. In fact, not one part of you could move. You can imagine the anxiety which would spring from that. It's through this powerful penance that the designer of purgatory gets his souls to taste the bitterness of their earthly avarice. The vice of avarice, or covetousness, was also a vice particularly feared by Christian monks. Many theological writers repeated the biblical warning that the love of money is the root of all evil. Monks such as the Eastern writer Evagrius were, like Dante, fearful of the vice because it seemingly could never reach satiety. As Evagrius puts it, the sea is never filled up even though it takes in a multitude of rivers. The desire of the avaricious person cannot get its fill of riches. Very simply, Evagrius continues, the desire of avarice makes you feverish in your labor and work to get to the next stage, to meet the next goal, to climb the next rung. Unlike the slothful, the avaricious are go-getters and self-motivated. The problem is they don't get off the ladder until it's too late. As Evagrius puts it, quote, the avaricious person fills his storerooms with gold. The one without possessions lays up treasure in heaven. Avarice then is a kind of materialistic warping of the theological virtue of hope. It turns the longing for good into the obsessive planning of the one who's anxious for those expectant yields. The problem is avarice sets the desire of the heart on future goods, but of a material nature. In this way, Dante's contrapasso is perfect. The law of the terrace is that the souls are rigidly fixed and bolted down, unable to move. And enslaved in this position, they begin to crave the freedom of mobility that the man who is not weighed down has. Or as Evagrius puts it, yet again, the monk free of possessions is like an athlete who cannot be thrown, and a light runner who speedily attains the prize. And finally, the third terrace the pilgrim and his guide explore is the terrace of the gluttonous, in which the penitent souls have to endure what I jokingly call the purgation of the French bakery. You can imagine arriving early in the morning on a cold day at a fantastic French bakery. The smell of butter and chocolate and freshly baked bread is in the air, as well as really strong coffee. But you have to sit there at the table, smelling the scents and watching others eat all morning long. In fact, all day, every day, you have to do this. And the more you are there, the hungrier you get. And you slowly waste away and turn into just a skeleton with skin on it. In a similar way, Dante's souls of the gluttonous are forced to smell the delicious fragrances which come from the tree. Quote, there was a tree found in the middle of the path, with fruits found that smelled both savory and good. And as we neared the tree, a voice from among the boughs called out, this is a food that you shall lack. And then it said, Mary gave more thought that the marriage feast be decorous and complete than for the mouth with which she pleads for you. Daniel scorned banquets and acquired wisdom. Honey and locusts were the food that nourished John the Baptist in the desert, for which he is glorious and as great as in the gospel is revealed to you. If avarice results in allowing the desire for material things to eclipse your desire for all other intangible goods, friendships, relationships, virtues, wisdom, etc., then gluttony is living your life de facto as if only the festive moment of sensual enjoyment is worth living for. For the medievals, as we have said, gluttony was more than overeating. It was dainty eating, food snobbery, drinking, the party life, and so on. This is the disposition of the young 30-something who lives only for the weekends, or the socialite who can't manage to get excited about anything but the elegant parties. In fact, we get a hint of that in Canto 23, when Dante runs into his old drinking buddy, Forese Donati. Dante there is overjoyed to see Forese, and actually he's a bit surprised. He didn't think his friend would make it. As the pilgrim will say to Forese in 23 verse 115, if you recall what you were with me, and I was with you, that memory now would still be painful. In the next canto, the pilgrim meets a poet from the previous generation by the name of Bonagiunta da Luca. Sitting among a group of gluttonous penitents who are, quote, gnashing their teeth on nothing in their hunger, the pilgrim spies a man who, quote, was muttering, and all I could make out was a word like gentuca, coming from his mouth. I think Dante means this to be a bit funny. A rival poet from the previous generation, whose art Dante did not admire because he thought it lacked artistic rigor, is shown here trying to recite his own poetry, but rather butchering it, because at the same time he enunciates the syllables, his teeth are chattering from hunger. Keep in mind, too, that the souls throughout this region are chanting off and on verses from the penitential Psalm 51. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. These narrative details help us appreciate Dante's critique of gluttony. The problem with the party life is that it effectively eclipses concerns for all else. Or to put it otherwise, if the lips and mouth are overemployed, as it were, in consumption and desiring physical things, then they're not left clean, empty, and available for the use of the higher ends of praise, which for Dante is the attempt to render concretely, in time, heavenly beauty. In fact, this is the secret of his poetry, which he has the pilgrim reveal in his beautiful conversation with Bonagiunta. Bonagiunta recognizes the pilgrim, and he asked him if this man standing in front of him is the one who wrote Donne c'avete intelletto d'amore, which you might remember was the turning point poem of the Vita Nuova, where Dante decided to stop writing merely about his emotional responses and start writing pure praise of Beatrice. Here's how the little conversation between Bonagiunta and the pilgrim goes. But tell me, Bonagiunta says, if I see before me the one who brought forth those new rhymes begun with ladies that have intelligence of love. And I to him, I am one who, when love inspires me, takes note. And as he dictates, deep within me, so I set it forth. O my brother, he said, now I understand the knot that kept the notary, Guitone, and me, that is poets in the previous generation. On this side of the sweet new style I hear, I clearly understand that your pen follows faithfully whatever love may dictate, which to be sure was not the case with ours. Then, as though with satisfaction, he was silent. This is an amazing passage where Dante, as it were, reveals the secret of his art, like some successful director or musician might in an interview on NPR. Dante is wholly committed to his art. There is no impediment, no obstacle, no barrier between him and the experience of love, so that his artistic pursuit is the real attempt to make concrete, in human language, the most profound experiences of love and beauty. When we were talking about the Inferno, we kept talking about zooming in and zooming out. That is about how Dante played with showing us the limited visions of sinners before zooming out to give us a providential vision of history in which the choices of these sinners were revealed in their full irony. In Purgatorio, we have a similar double-angled view. That is, we have these moments like Virgil's speech on love, Virgil's speech on mirrors, in which we get a glimpse of the joy which awaits the penitent souls. But then we also zoom back in, as it were, and look at the soul's particular suffering. And so it's important to remember throughout that these instances of pain are not meant as punishments, but rather as preparatory exercises for experiencing that glory to come. Indeed, if you have gotten even a vague sense through my discussion of these passions purged in purgatory, pride, envy, wrath, acedia, avarice, or gluttony, of how easy it is to slip into them, and then how difficult it is to manage them, then I think you've got Dante's point. We feel helpless in a way, standing before the inner life of our hearts. If it produces in you a kind of groaning, in which you become irritated with your own radical moral limitations, then this is Dante's point. And it's exactly what Pope Adrian V in Canto 19 speaks to. And indeed, I think he's the spokesman for all the souls in this region of purgatory, when he tells the pilgrim, now go your way. I would not keep you longer, for your being here prevents the tears with which I ripen that of which you speak. In other words, the penitent soul wishes to return to developing that quality of knowledge, that inner wisdom which he says is fed by tears. Thus, you could say that the prayer of the heart, or if you like, what the medieval monks called the prayer of tears, in which you not only have before the mind's eye, some truth or doctrine, but begin to long for it so much that the affections of the heart have begun to warm. At this point, then, I'd like to make a major transition. We've talked about the individual terraces and the passions that they purge. Now I want to talk about the tool used to get that interior cleansing. And what is more, I want to suggest that we have to understand it as a reflection of the medieval tradition of monastic affective theology, which I'd like to explain now. Before describing its history, take a quick look at Canto 18. One of the souls there says, "May our zeal," the Italian word is studio, "may our zeal for doing good make grace grow green again." And then the pilgrim addresses the crowd in verse 105 and 106, "O gente in cui fervore aguto adesso rincompie," that is, "O people in whom your sharp fervor now amends." Both of these terms, studio and fervore, are related to important Latin theological terms, studium and fervor. Is to this prayer of the heart, or prayer of tears, to which studium and fervor are related. As I said in the introductory lecture, although the souls in purgatorio are saved, forgiven of their sins, they're not yet ready to see God. Their ability to participate in the heavenly community is still limited by the vicious habits they did not devote themselves to reforming in life. Their heads are in the right place. They desire to see God and to have a vision of Him. But like Manfred, they still have their wounds on them. Their hearts are not there. Or more accurately, in medieval terminology, their affectus has not yet been kindled. In the language of medieval monastic speculation on purgatory, these souls are boni, good, but yet imperfecti. Well, in Dante's day, the acknowledged experts in the theory and practice of effecting such deep transformation, overcoming the gap between head knowledge and heart knowledge, were the monastic spiritual writers. They focused on developing what they called the reasoning of the heart, the cogitatio cordis. These monks specialized in constructing exercises which led to this deep transformation. That is, exercises through which souls became capable over time, not just of assenting to truth, but to loving it, desiring it, responding to it with the affectus. Dante shows then that his souls within purgatorio must submit themselves to that discipline, which was the hallmark of contemporary monastic spiritual writers. But in particular, I'm interested in Dante's depiction of the monastic reading practices of the souls of purgatorio, how they participate in a slow, meditative form of reading, which was the special monastic tool recommended by the spiritual masters for absorbing and internalizing truth. It's precisely because the penitent souls in purgatorio neglected this discipline in life that they now have to do it after death. And this is indeed a slow, painful process, one which requires time and repetition, because the purgatorial souls have to overcome their characteristic penchants to their specific negative moral dispositions. Or to put it in monastic terms, the outer fire of their suffering must cleanse them so that the inner fire, the fervor amoris, their love for God, may burn as hot and brightly as it should. Throughout purgatorio then, but especially among these canti, we find souls fasting, engaged in acts of penance, chanting the divine office and praying according to the medieval spiritual masters. Lectio, this slow form of reading, was also one of the pillars of the discipline of the monks. For example, one writer, Peter of Celle, said that Lectio was a fluid activity during which interior transformation took place. It was, quote, a movement of reading into prayer. Like Bernard of Clairvaux and Anselm before him, Peter likes to use gustatory metaphors for this, reading as an act of absorbing spiritual nourishment. Lectio, he says, is a most rich meal, and souls engaged in it are said to ruminate on the sweetest flowers of sacred scripture. But at the same time it provides nourishment. Lectio also is a violent process. It purges our inner depths, he says, and it amputates wicked thoughts. Thus, the monk's constant meditation in this life on scriptural truths and his possible fate, such as burning in the ignis purgatorius, leads to the purgation of the inner parts of the heart. And this renders purgatory in the next life unnecessary. The great Carthusian writer Guigo II also describes this movement of reading into prayer as purgative. Interior purgation is the momentous occasion in which the external cleansing of baptism now culminates in the interior cleansing of the heart. And such purgation is preparatory for the experience of God, the chief aim of the monk's spiritual exercises. Guigo describes this experience in overwhelmingly sensual terms and with great rhetorical exuberance. To experience God, he says, is to have desire inflamed, to be enveloped in the sweet dew of heaven, to be anointed with oil, to have your weary soul refreshed, to have your dry soul revitalized with oil, to have hunger sated, to be made to forget earthly things, to be enlivened, strengthened, to be made drunk while still remaining sober. In fact, this experience of God is the distinguishing feature which separates the mere thinking of the learned scholar and the Christian sage. Both Christian, sage, and scholar are able to use their intellectual powers to contemplate the excellence of good things. But mere scholars lack the spirit of wisdom, which would lead them to smell, taste, feel, and be warmed by the experience of God. The scholar is, then, only deep in his thoughts because he's not deep in his experience. Thus, any true program of reading must be directed at such an effective end. And this is the case in Guigo's four-step program. He describes this reading program as a ladder which stands on the ground but penetrates the clouds of heaven and explores the secrets of heaven. The first step is slow reading, lectio, which attentively takes in Scripture with an expectation that the scriptural passage under consideration is sweet and crammed full of meaning. Step 2 is what he calls meditatio. It seeks out fuller explanations. For example, when meditating on a verse such as, "Blessed are those who are clean in heart, for they will see God," he who meditates considers each phrase and word in turn, asking why Scripture does not say something else, like, "Blessed are those who are clean in the body." It allows the mind to play freely in search of other scriptural passages which seem to reflect on the same phenomenon. The mind recalls, for instance, how Psalm 23 says, "Only the innocent in hands and clean of heart will ascend to God." Or how the psalmist prayed, "Create in me, O Lord, a clean heart." Or how Job made a pact with his eyes. Meditatio, then, contemplates the awesome promise of the vision of God which will be given to the pure in heart, and how such vision will satisfy all desires. And finally, it considers how one can acquire such cleanness of heart. It is this contemplation of the greatness of the promise and the weakness of the soul which leads to the impassioned state of oratio, or prayer, in which the soul acknowledges its inability and it begins to pant, thirst, and long for heavenly things. This is the third step on the ladder. In oratio, the soul longs to know God no longer in the surface way of the letter, but in the sense of experience. And in this state of prayer, increased desire comes, Guigo says, and fire is ignited. In short, this process of meditation on words leads to a point where speech ends. Quote, "By words such as these and similar ones, the desire is inflamed. In this way, the soul's affectus is stretched out broad." Guigo says that tears are the certain sign that such an effective experience will soon be experienced, for they affect the inner washing, the inner purgation. O blessed tears, he says, through which interior blemishes are purged. Keep in mind Adrian V's request to be left alone to his tears. It seems that he's already reached the level of oratio. In sum, Guigo recommends a process of reading which begins with an attentive, imaginative focus on the words, a middle stage in which those truths are made more interior, and a final stage which is marked by the fire and the warmth of affection. Thus, this reasoning of the heart is an effective reading which ends in prayer. But in the next century, Franciscan spiritual treatises added one more idea, the idea of imitation. The Franciscans recommended a kind of imaginative rumination on Scripture, which focused mainly on the life of Christ vividly present in the mind of the reader. It was an internal exercise which sought to rouse pity, sorrow, and compassion in response to what Christ endured. Franciscans said you could also practice an imitatio Mariae. The intention of reliving the lives of Mary and Jesus, then, in the mind, was to help readers live interiorly the suffering Jesus and Mary experienced in their bodies, thus uniting them through contemplation to Christ and Mary, an affective imitatio. Through such imitatio, the reader too could become a second Christ, an alter Christus. It was this form of reading which was woven into the fabric of a monk's day. Here's how one author explains it. Lectio Divina was one of the lengthiest and most important exercises of the medieval cloister. With manual labor in the office, it was a primary enterprise. This sacred reading took place each day, lasting several hours, about 6 in the winter and 3 in the summer, because of that season's more important agricultural work. On Sundays and major feast days, Lectio filled all the canon's free time. Each remained in the cloister or scriptorium, covering his head with his hood for the sake of easier recollection, to read the scriptures or the fathers of the church in order to find God. Now, with all this in mind, we can come back to Dante with a deeper understanding of what all of those voices and examples and carvings are doing in each one of the terraces. This is exactly the kind of meditative reading we find throughout these canti, as if the souls within these canti are trying to form a different relationship to the scriptural prayers they had always known. As if rather than just talking about them, they are now stepping into those verses or consuming them or chewing them. For example, in Canto 19, the avaricious prays Psalm 118:25. My soul cleaveth unto the dust, quicken thou me according to thy word. That is, David's despairing cry to God for help. But here the souls of the avaricious, in addition to being forced to see, up close and personal as it were, their own fixation on earthly things, are also reenacting the biblical prayer, entering into the Word, literally dwelling within it in their physical posture, or if you like, performing what had been merely head knowledge before. What's more, in every one of these canti, we note that the souls are meditating on classical and biblical examples of vice and virtue, whether it be the prompt military actions of Julius Caesar to inspire the slothful, or the terrible poverty of Mary to inspire the avaricious. Canto 20 is my personal favorite. In that canto, the pilgrim speaks with Hughs Capet, the founder of the French dynastic line, which was still ruling in Dante's day, the Capetians. The main point of Hugh's speech is yet again a vicious political denunciation of the evil shepherds of Dante's day. But at this point, I want to focus more on the rhetorical details, how Hugh makes his point. Dante at first doesn't know who he is. He merely, while passing through the ranks and files of prostrate souls, hears one soul shout out, Dolce Maria! That is, oh, sweet Mary! He's clearly deep in some personal meditation and is so moved by what he meditatively sees that he shouts out with compassion. But fascinatingly, the poet describes him as calling out, Dolce Maria, through his tears, even as a woman does in labor. Pause to consider this a moment in light of the historical context I've provided above. The voice goes on. How poor you were is witnessed by the inn where you set down your holy burden. That is, while meditating on the Nativity and Mary giving birth in the stable, Hugh is so moved that he himself shouts out, as if he were giving birth. Thus we have a perfect example of that imitatio Mariae I spoke of earlier. Hugh then goes on to explain to the pilgrim the quasi-liturgy in which the souls of this terrace participate. The words that I called out before, he says, of the Holy Spirit's one and only bride, which made you turn to me for explanation, are the responses, as long as it is day, in all our prayers, but when night falls, we then intone an opposite refrain. He then goes on to mention Pygmalion, Midas, Aachen, Sapphira, Polymnister, and Crassus, the famous examples of evil uses of wealth. Thus, the souls in this terrace recite positive and negative examples, but in the manner of a monastic antiphonal chant. During the day, Hugh says, the souls retell stories as responses in a prayer, and in the night, they repeat negative moral examples antiphonally to the positive ones of the day. But what is more, they don't just go over and over again, these stories, but they celebrate the destruction of Heliodorus and shout out loud with righteous anger, mocking Crassus for his taste for gold. Some souls are loud and some are quiet in their vocalizations of the condemnations. The more passion they feel over the evil, the more their hearts are pricked and goaded to express the affection of righteous anger or joy in the good. They cry out, Hugh says, according to the zeal that spurs our speech. And the word he uses, latfetion, is the key word. All the souls throughout purgatory, we gather from what Hugh tells us, are engaged in such literary and biblical meditations. What he reveals is that the goal of such literary meditation is to bring the heart to cherish what it had been hard to in life, and to come to delight in what the intellect knows unambiguously as good. Finally, note that Hugh is beginning to bring this warmth of passion out of his readings and into his life. For example, after telling his own story, Hugh offers a prophecy in which he likens the current besieged Pope to Christ being mocked, and the reckless current French king to Pilate. The righteous anger he clearly feels, so very close to Dante's own voice, is shaped by biblical passages of longing. He interrupts himself, yelling out, O Lord, when shall I be gladdened at the sight of vengeance that as yet concealed, hidden in your mind, makes sweet your wrath? Hugh's biblically molded outcry is a sign that the sin to which he was once prone, the avaricious acquisition of land, is now becoming repulsive to him. Analogously, at the end of Canto 22, the tree calls out examples of poverty, which the starving souls have come to love. It's in Canto 23, though, that all these things come together. As we've said, this is where Dante bumps into his old, now reformed drinking buddy, Foresi Donati. Like all the penitent, gluttonous souls, his eyes are dark and sunken, his face pale, his flesh wasted, that the skin took all its shape from bones. And then the poet says something amazing. Quote, the sockets of their eyes resembled rings without their gems. He who reads Omo in men's faces would easily make out the M. In other words, their faces have become so thin, their eyes so sunken, that the nose and cheekbones form the letter M, with the eyes forming two O's between the M. That is, spelling out the word homo, Latin and Italian for man. This is an extraordinary moment. We know that Foresi, like the others, is reading in this meditative way and contemplating on examples of poverty, while performing these exercises of fasting. And thus, while he's conducting his reading, his very face, his very visage is being rewritten, so that his humanity is now becoming apparent once again. Phorese then was like a text poorly written, but as he reads, the old text is now being scratched out, and through his cooperation with God, he is being rewritten to become the text he was meant to be. Thus we find Phorese beginning to respond to these trials with joy. For example, he corrects himself, saying that he should not refer to purgatory as a place of punishment and pain, but rather of solace. Furthermore, Phorese seems to be conforming himself to Christ through his meditation. He says, for example, that the same will which caused Christ to shout out, Eli, aloud in an act of voluntary joyful suffering, which led to the liberation of sinners, is what pulses through the souls here and inspires them to go and listen to the exempla of the tree whose fruit they voluntarily forego, a denial which leads them to their own eventual liberty. It's beautiful to note, then, that heavenly bliss doesn't seem too far off for Phorese, as if the light of heaven has already begun to shine through his eyes. Phorese has shed that sense of morose solitude which marks the souls of hell and characterizes still the souls in the lower terraces of purgatory. Phorese is indifferent to the ugliness of his scabbed face. He's elated to see his friends. He's more eager to hear Dante's story than tell his own, but he's also willing to oblige when asked to speak first. He's as much concerned for his brother's soul as he is for himself. And when Piccarda and Nella are mentioned, he seems to lose himself in affectionate, selfless praise of their virtues. It is my Nella, his wife, whose flooding tears so quickly brought me to drink sweet wormwood in the torments. The taste of bitter things is starting to become sweet. Phorese's smile is what is most memorable from this canto. I'd like to suggest, then, that in the rewritten face of Phorese, we're beginning to see some of that heavenly joy shining through his visage. We're beginning to experience something of the delight of the rewritten text. But the rewriting has come about through his deep, meditative act of rereading with the heart.